So welcome to Left Horizon's public meeting. 50 years ago, on the 11th of September, there was a crushing defeat of the socialist movement in Chile and of a democratically elected socialist government. A catastrophe which reverberated around the world, really. And we think it's essential, even 50 years on, to draw the important lessons from this defeat, not just to mourn, but to learn from the mistakes that were made, and to emphasize the international dimensions of this catastrophe. We've invited Andreas Bülow from a Danish Marxist from the newspaper The Socialisten, who has extensive experience in Latin America as well. So we have a British, Danish, Latin American combination of experiences. So Andreas is going to speak for 25 to 30 minutes. And then I'd obviously invite everybody here to make their own contributions and questions. So with that, Andreas, you're very welcome. And I'll maybe give you a message when you got 10 minutes left. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, comrade. I hope that my voice gets through. So yes, okay. It sounds like that. Okay, no. So first of all, thank you a lot for inviting me to speak. I wanted just to introduce myself. The reason why I speak on Chile and Latin America in general is that I lived for a number of years in Venezuela, actually, working as a full-timer, as a Marxist. I wrote a number of different articles about Latin America under the pen name Patrick Larsen. Some of you might have read it. I'm also married to a Venezuelan woman, and I travel extensively in Latin America also in recent years. So now the question of Chile, I think, is not just a historical discussion. Of course, it's very interesting to discuss history and the lessons from it. Also from a theoretical point of view, from a Marxist point of view, but it's not only about that. I don't know about the UK, but here in Denmark we have a company. Hello, can you hear me? Sure. Okay, good.
Carry on.
Okay, cool. Okay, here in Denmark we have a company called Volt. I don't know if you also have it in the UK, but you must have Just Eat or other food delivery companies. And when I meet them a lot in the streets of Copenhagen, and all of them are from Chile. They are youngsters coming here because of the situation in Chile and Argentina is so dire for young people that they don't have any work. So they come to different places in Europe and so on, just in search of work. And I've often discussed with these people. They're also working under pretty difficult work conditions here in Denmark, actually. Some of them stay only a couple of months and they go to other countries and so on. But my point is that it's a testimony to the bankruptcy of Chilean capitalism, that you have so many young people going out of the country to work in other countries. And that was also, I would argue, the main factor why we had the big social upheaval of 2019, just before coronavirus hit the world. We had an extraordinary situation in Chile. Of course, today's discussion is not about that in itself, but I think it does add another layer or another weight to the discussion about what happened in 73, in my opinion. So just one word of warning before I go into the subject. I can only give you like a brief overview today of what I would argue was really a revolutionary process, a process of revolution, counter-revolution. But if you want to go into details with this, there are several books, of course, to read, but I would argue actually that there's a documentary film, a big, important documentary film that you should read on this, that you should view on this subject, which is called The Battle for Chile. It's a documentary which was made by a very famous Chilean filmmaker called Patricio Guzman. And he began the recordings in, I believe, towards the end of 72 and the beginning of 73. And then he follows the process of revolution and counter-revolution until the final coup d'etat of 11th of September 73. And it's a movie that is in 3 parts. And you can actually, I tried to find it. It's, of course, it's in Spanish original, but oh, there's already a comrade who sent the link. Thank you so much, Des. So I think in that documentary, you really get a feel for the working class, the peasants actually also, but also for the counter-revolution, for how the counter-revolution mobilized the middle classes and so on. It's in 3 parts, and each part of them are 1.5 hours. Guzman himself, he was thrown into the National Stadium of Chile, where he was imprisoned just as so many others, political prisoners. But he managed to go out after 11 days. And he had been so clever to, to hide the different film roles in the house of his cousin. So once he got out of the National Stadium and he went into exile, he managed to smuggle this out. And with the help of Cuba, he managed to produce the documentary in 3 parts. Guzman was the fortunate one of them. There was also the cameraman of that documentary was not so fortunate, a man named Jorge Müller Silva. He was tortured to death, actually, by the coup mongers and the secret police. He was a member of the MIR, which was a sectarian left-wing organization, which nonetheless did have some support in some parts of the vanguard in Chile. Now, just to give a very brief overview, Chile was a country where the bourgeoisie was subordinated to imperialism. And, it never had a bourgeois democratic revolution. Sometimes when we argue with different people in the ex-colonial countries, they always say to us that, well, the theory of the permanent revolution that Trotsky made is like an Eurocentric or from the old world, they say. But that's absolutely nonsense, in my opinion. And you can actually, if you study the different Latin American socialists, they independently of Trotsky, they came to the completely same conclusions, which is that that the national emergent bourgeoisies of these countries, they are absolutely incapable of carrying through the tasks of their own revolutions. So that task passes on to the proletariat afterwards. And that was not just Trotsky. Actually, if you read, for example, Mariátegui in Peru, he came to the exact same conclusion as Trotsky. Or Mella in Cuba came to the same conclusions. So it's not true that the theory of the permanent revolution is something which is conscribed to Europe. It's absolutely not true. So in Chile, the labor movement had a little bit of a peculiar tradition. Whereas in a lot of European countries, you have the Social Democratic Party, which is older than the Communist Party. In Chile, it was a little bit different. You have actually the whole of the Social Democratic Party of the original one in Chile passed over to the October Revolution and joined the Communist International. But once Stalinism began with the theory also of the theory of two stages in all the ex-colonial countries, then the Stalinists really messed things up in the whole of Latin America, and thus it gave rise to a different group inside the vanguard in Chile, who in the 1930s they set up a different party which was called the Socialist Party, but it's not really the Social Democrats of the old school. That's important to understand, and that also played a role a little bit later. So what we call the Socialist Party in Chile was not in its inception actually a traditional social democracy. It later became obviously under the influence of bureaucracy and bureaucrats and so on. But initially it was a Marxist-Leninist party and a Marxist-Leninist program. Of course, with different theoretical faults and so on, but that's just, it's an important nuance to understand. I'm not going into a lot of details, but Chile also had a very brief socialist government in 1932, which was very short-lived. And it carried actually through some laws that were later carried on to the Allende era, and that the Allende, he partly took advantage of some of these laws. But that experience in the 1930s was very, very short-lived. And afterward for counter-revolution. And then I'm going to jump a little bit because of time restraint. But in the 1960s, Chile was already living a moment of really volatile situation. The land reform was probably the biggest issue in the country, and even the bourgeois could not really rule in the same way. So in 1964, the Frey government was formed, and they also allegedly wanted a revolutionary program. It was the Christian Democrats. And you could say it's kind of like the liberals into power, you could say. But they were also completely incapable of carrying really through the land reform. There are different studies, but many figures show that even their own moderate program, they could only carry through around 30% of it. So it was not very successful. And there was a pretty big demoralization on this government, about this government. So the Socialist Party had run on the different elections together with the Communist Party, and also with a number of smaller petty bourgeois parties and so on. Especially in 1958, Salvador Allende was very, very close actually to winning the presidential elections, very close. But he didn't manage. And then in 64, of course, Frey won. And then only in 1970, he got elected. He won by 36.4% of the vote. But already when he won the vote, very shortly after, the bourgeois were really beginning to get worried Of course, Allende and the alliance that he had, they had a program which initially was, of course, moderate. They wanted step by step to, to begin the task of implementing socialism, but there were also a lot of divisions inside it. You had, on the one hand, you had the Communist Party, which was really the right wing of this coalition. The Communist Party throughout this period stood on the absolute right of the Socialist Party. And again, they wanted to limit actually the popular unity. They were trying to include these small petty bourgeois parties in the coalition with one specific purpose, which was to, always to have an excuse for not carrying through a socialist program. Whereas inside the Socialist Party, the situation was much more mixed. There were big layers that genuinely thought that you could begin the transformation through a legal process with the government and so on. But already once it was clear that Allende won the elections, the bourgeoisie began a process of counterattacks. You had the assassination of Snyder, who was the army general. He was killed. Then later, all the opposition parties, they began to put pressure on Allende to sign like a constitutional guarantee that he would not go beyond the bounds of the constitution. He also had to sign, for example, that he wouldn't put people inside the army that were from outside the army, which was a pretty important point. And also that he wouldn't create private militias. Of course, the bourgeois, they created their own private militia, which was called Patria y Libertad, which was a fascist organization, actually. And they counted, throughout these years, they counted heavily on that in order to destroy the revolution. So you can really see the hypocrisy of these people. Of course, at this point, there was the masses began to exert pressure on the government, and the government began to go much further than what was probably intended in the first place. In July 1970, you had the 71. You had the nationalization of the copper mines, which was a very important gesture, a very important means. And you had also partly the government beginning to gain control of some parts of the banking system. And you had Allende, for example, with the nationalizations. I mean, of course, we don't have illusions in Allende as a revolutionary leader. He was not a revolutionist. He was a reformist, in my opinion. But it is true that, for example, the nationalization that he did really pissed off the bourgeois immediately. And I think one of the reasons is the way in which he actually did it, because he explained that these multinationals had really ransacked Chile for so many years. They had gained huge profit, and he listed the profits that they gained, and the investments. And then he said, well, you don't need compensation. Actually, you owe money to the Chilean state because you have really looted the country for so many years. And that was really, really something that where he gained the hatred of the bourgeois. Then, of course, you had the United States, which was very, very actively involved throughout this process. They began, first of all, to deny credit to Chile. And then they also, of course, began a whole number of subversive, really, actions against the government. Began to fund El Mercurio, which was a opposition paper, to run a lot of campaigns against the government. They began to also to make an alliance with the lorry drivers, and the lorry drivers organization. They made a strike in October 72, which was the biggest one. Then later they also made successive other strikes, which was really not strikes, but actually buses lockouts. And of course, they also began to fund this fascist organization that I mentioned previously. So I'm going to jump a little bit because I only have 10 minutes left. So you in the discussion you can supplement, of course. But what was the answer of Allende to these different sabotage acts of sabotage of imperialism and of the old ruling class? Well, again and again, it was actually negotiations. He tried to negotiate again and again. There were some moments where he, especially towards the end, not in September, but actually a little bit before, around the time of the Tanquetazo, which I will also mention briefly, that he began to mobilize the masses more effectively. But he didn't dare really take the ultimate steps in that direction. He tried all the way to negotiate with the Christian Democrats. Then there was the question of scarcity also, with the boycott of the bourgeoisie, trying to really put a halt on everything. And the lorry drivers lockout, it also was a pretty effective measure because it meant that all the exports of Chile couldn't get out of the country and so on. So the state was almost bankrupt at one point. But most importantly, and I want to emphasize this before my time runs up, you had the development of what was called the cordones industriales, which I think in English probably translates mostly into industrial belts. That was a really important factor in this situation. And I would argue that actually in making this lead off, I reread a book in Spanish about the cordones industriales, and I would argue it was one of the moments in probably in the whole history of Latin America where you had the biggest fluxion, or the biggest presence of organs of dual power. You had workers in a number of places. Just in June 1972, you had 169 factories in Cerrillos, which was the belt around Santiago, that were organized. You had factory seizures in so many places. You had workers occupying the factories. You had a lot of peasant committees. Then they created the JAPs, which was the Juntas de Abastecimiento Popular, which was the committees in order to control the fluctuation of goods and of food stuff and so on. But you know, the thing was that the Communist Party again and again, they actually tried to undo workers' control. And the most fatal mistake was that they began to, together with Allende, with the acceptance of Allende, they began to accept arm controls law, which really meant the disarmament of the working class. And you had actually the army in the month leading up to the coup d'etat in September. You had the army going from factory to factory in so many places, going and disarming the workers before the coup. And that was really a huge mistake on part of the left wing. In March 1973, you had a decisive moment, I would argue, where there was parliamentary elections, and the bourgeois opposition was really mobilizing its supporters in order to have 2/3 control of the parliament, but they didn't manage. Actually, the Popular Unity parties, they grew in support. They managed to get 43.6% of the votes, which was unheard of. I mean, in all the elections in Chilean history, always the governing party was used to have a small or mid-sized defeat in the midway elections, but not this time. They actually grew in support. But the problem was that in the streets, Allende and the leaders of the Popular Unity, they didn't count really on the masses, and they tried to reach a compromise all the time, every time that there was a new crisis. And after March 1973, the bourgeois opposition shifted tactic from parliamentary to extra-parliamentary. They first made a new lorry truck drivers lockout. Then they made a strike of the functionaries in one of the important mines called El Teniente mine. And then you had, of course, the first coup, because it's I just wanted to, and I'm going to end by this. The coup in September, on the 11th of September, was not the first coup. There was a number of counter-revolutionary strikes, and that was why, for example, our historical tendency, the militant, foresaw this long time before it happened. We predicted this, and it was because in June you had the Tanquetazo, for example, where a whole regiment inside Santiago, Panzer regiment, they tried to make a coup d'etat. They were defeated, and there was mass demonstrations in favor. They were also part of the Socialist Party that wanted to radicalize, centered around the chairman at the time, Carlos Altamirano. He made a speech calling for some kind of mobilization to deepen the revolution, to radicalize the revolution. But on the whole, the Socialist Party didn't have any real plan for clandestine work and so on. So, well, as you all know, it ended in really in a bloodshed at that time, and really in a disaster in any thinkable way, with a deep counter-revolution. And with a counter-revolution, it took many years for the proletariat really to regain power. You had thousands of people tortured, killed, and so on. Well, my main point, just to sum up, is that I think the main lesson of Chile, in our opinion, is that you can't really take the old state machinery and just have confidence in that state machinery. And Allende himself, although it is true that he stayed inside the presidential palace and probably killed himself, he didn't surrender. but it's true that the illusions that he had in negotiations and in also in the fact that the army would stay neutral or stay outside of the counter revolution, that was absolutely it failed completely. And well, I'm just going to end on that note, and I think that it bears important lessons for a lot of processes going on today. Last year, you had the situation with Pedro Castillo, who I mean, after what 1.5 years, he was also thrown out. You have had so many coup d'états in Latin America, and this continues today. Yeah, I think that was what I wanted to say. So, yeah, thank you.